All eyes turned to the man in the janitor's uniform mopping the gleaming floors of Benroya Hall. His trembling hands gripped the mop handle where they once held a violin bow that moved audiences to tears, and his weathered face showed the scars of a man who'd lost everything that mattered, but those hands held a secret that would soon shake the foundations of Seattle's most prestigious symphony orchestra. It was a bitter January evening when David Keller, 51 years old, arrived at the Seattle Symphony Orchestra's rehearsal hall with his cleaning cart. His worn work boots squeaked against the polished marble as he pushed past the music stands where world-renowned virtuosos prepared for international performances. David had worked as a night janitor for 3 years now, invisible to the maestros in their tailored suits, transparent to the soloists earning six-figure salaries, non-existent to the musicians who competed for positions that could define entire careers. He cleaned the same stages where miracles of sound happened nightly, his eyes occasionally catching the gleam of instruments he once played better than anyone alive. The orchestra was in absolute crisis that week. Their upcoming charity gala, expected to raise $12 million for youth music programs, was 5 days away, and they still had no soloist for the centerpiece, Paganini's Violin Concerto No. 3, considered one of the most technically impossible pieces ever written. 6 violinists had attempted it. All 6 had failed at the double-stop harmonics that required playing the strings simultaneously, while creating bell-like overtones. Without a soloist, the gala would be cancelled, the donations lost, and the orchestra's reputation permanently damaged. In the main rehearsal hall, surrounded by empty chairs and music stands, the orchestra's leadership was in emergency session. The tension was thick enough to cut with a conductor's baton. "This is a disaster," Maestro Friedrich von Stein shouted, his German accent sharpening with frustration. He was 58, classically trained in Berlin, and had spent 30 years building a reputation for perfection. 5 days. We have 5 days before we must cancel the most important fundraiser in our history. "Friedrich, we've auditioned every available virtuoso on the West Coast," said Catherine Price, 42, the orchestra's concertmaster and a violinist who'd spent 2 decades climbing to her position. "The harmonics in the third movement are impossible. Even Perlman wouldn't attempt this piece at his peak." "Then we choose a different piece," suggested Jonathan Reed, the orchestra's executive director, 50 years old and perpetually worried about donors and public image. "Tchaikovsky, Mendelssohn, something achievable." And admit defeat, Friedrich slammed his baton on the podium. "The gala program has been printed. The donors were promised Paganini. We cannot simply substitute Mozart like we are amateur hour." "Better amateur hour than no hour at all," said Grace Hamilton, 67, a veteran second violinist who'd spent 40 years in the orchestra and had grown bitter watching younger players surpass her. "Face reality, Friedrich. There's no one who can play this piece. Not in 5 days. Not with the precision we need." Through the rehearsal hall's glass walls, David pushed his cleaning cart, methodically working his way around the building. His hands shook constantly, a tremor that had defined his existence for 18 years. He'd learned to hide it, to work around it, to pretend it didn't control every aspect of his life. But inside the rehearsal hall, he could hear them discussing the Paganini. And despite everything, despite the years and the loss and the pain, his heart ached. He knew that piece. He'd performed it at Carnegie Hall when he was 28, receiving a 15-minute standing ovation. Critics had called it the definitive interpretation of the century. That was another lifetime ago. "What about David Keller?" came a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. Professor Isaac Rosenberg stood there, leaning on his cane. He was 73, officially retired, but still consulting for the orchestra on difficult repertoire. His presence commanded immediate respect. He'd mentored dozens of world-class violinists over a 50-year career. "Who?" Jonathan asked, confused. "The janitor," Isaac said, walking slowly into the hall. "David Keller, the man cleaning your floors right now." The room erupted in laughter. "The janitor?" Friedrich almost choked. "You want our janitor to perform Paganini? Isaac, have you finally lost your mind? Perhaps you should check security footage from last Tuesday night," Isaac said calmly, pulling out his phone. "Specifically, camera 7 on the main stage. Around 11 p.m., he pulled up a video and hit play. The screen showed the empty concert hall, then a figure in janitor's clothes walking onto the stage. David. He picked up a violin that had been left on a chair, someone's instrument forgotten after rehearsal. What happened next made everyone in the room go silent. David raised the violin to his shoulder with a posture so perfect it looked sculpted. Then he began to play. The phone's speakers couldn't do justice to the sound, but even through tinny audio, the music was transcendent. David played the exact passage that had defeated 6 professional violinists, the double-stop harmonics in the third movement. His fingers flew across the fingerboard with speed that seemed impossible, creating 2 melodic lines simultaneously while producing ethereal harmonics that sounded like bells from another dimension. He played for 3 minutes, lost in the music, his eyes closed, his trembling hands suddenly rock steady as they danced across the strings. When he finished, he simply set down the violin, wiped it clean with his shirt, and returned to mopping. The video ended. The rehearsal hall was absolutely silent. "That's not possible," Catherine whispered. "Those hands, the technique, that's virtuoso level. Beyond virtuoso level. Who is he?" Jonathan demanded, staring at Isaac. "Really?" Isaac smiled sadly. "David Keller won the International Tchaikovsky competition 18 years ago. He was called the greatest violinist of his generation. Critics compared him to Heifetz, to Oistrakh. He sold out Carnegie Hall, the Royal Albert Hall, La Scala. He had a recording contract with Deutsche Grammophon worth millions." "What happened?" Grace asked, her dismissive tone completely gone. "An accident," Isaac said quietly. 18 years ago, David was driving home from a rehearsal with his wife, who was also a violinist, and their 3-year-old daughter. A drunk driver ran a red light, hit them at 60 miles per hour. David survived. His family didn't. The room was silent except for the distant sound of David's cleaning cart. "The trauma gave him a neurological condition," Isaac continued. "Essential tremor. His hands shake constantly. It destroyed his ability to play. Or so he thought. What he discovered, what I've been watching him discover over the past few months, is that when he touches a violin, the tremors stop. Completely. The music is literally his medicine." Friedrich stared at the frozen image on Isaac's phone. "If this is true, if this man can really play Paganini, he can," Isaac said firmly. "I taught David from age 8. I've never seen talent like his. Not before, not since. The accident took everything from him, his family, his career, his identity. He spent 3 years institutionalized for depression and PTSD. He attempted suicide twice, but the music never left him. It just waited." "This is insane," Jonathan said. "Even if he can play, we can't put a janitor on stage as our soloist. The donors would think it's a joke, would they?" Isaac challenged. "Or would they recognize genius when they hear it? David doesn't need our permission to be extraordinary. He just needs a chance." "There's another problem," Catherine said, though her voice had softened. "Mental stability. You said he was institutionalized. What if he breaks down on stage? What if the pressure triggers something? Then we'll deal with it," Isaac said. "But I've known David for 43 years. I know his strength, and I know that he's ready. He just doesn't know it yet." Friedrich stood up and walked to the window. David was visible in the corridor, emptying a trash bin, his hands shaking as he worked. "I want to audition him," Friedrich said finally. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m. If he can truly play as that video shows, we'll discuss it further. But Isaac, if he fails, if this is some elaborate mistake, the responsibility is yours." "I accept that responsibility," Isaac said. "There's one more thing you should know," Grace said quietly. "I recognize his name. David Keller. He was married to Elena Petrova, wasn't he?" Isaac nodded. "Yes. Elena was one of the finest violinists of her generation. They met at Juilliard. Their daughter's name was Sophie. She was 3 years old when she died. David hasn't spoken her name aloud in 18 years. The room fell silent with the weight of that tragedy. "Get him," Friedrich said. "Bring him in here. I want to speak with him." Isaac walked out to the corridor where David was cleaning. "David," he called softly. David turned, his face showing immediate recognition followed by something like fear. "Professor Rosenberg." I didn't know you were consulting here. I've been looking for you for 3 years, Isaac said gently. Ever since I heard you'd been released from the treatment center. Why didn't you contact me? David's hands shook harder as he gripped the mop. Because I'm not who I was. That person died in the accident. I'm just trying to get by. That's not what the security footage shows, Isaac said. David, they saw you play. The Paganini harmonics. They want to audition you. David's face went pale. No, absolutely not. I can't. I can't perform anymore, Isaac. I clean floors. That's all I can do now. David, listen to me. Isaac stepped closer. Your hands don't shake when you play. I've watched the footage a dozen times. The moment you touch that violin, you're healed. Don't you see? The music is your cure. It always has been. It's also my curse, David said, his voice breaking. Every note I play, I hear Elena. Every phrase reminds me of Sophie. I can't go back to that world. It hurts too much. Then play for them, Isaac said softly. Play for Elena. Play for Sophie. Honor their memory with your gift. They wouldn't want you hiding in the shadows, David. They'd want you to shine. David closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. I haven't touched a violin in front of anyone in 18 years. The thought of walking onto a stage, of having people watch me, of risking failure, it terrifies me. That's good, Isaac said. Fear means you still care. It means you're alive. David, I'm not asking you to be who you were. I'm asking you to discover who you can become. Friedrich appeared in the doorway. Keller, I'm Maestro von Stein. I'd like to speak with you about tomorrow's audition. David looked at Friedrich, then at Isaac, then down at his shaking hands. I need time to think. You have until morning, Friedrich said, not unkindly. 9 a.m. Main stage. If you choose to audition, we'll have a violin ready for you. If you don't show up, we'll understand. But Mr. Keller, I watched that security footage. What you did in those 3 minutes. That was not the playing of a janitor. That was the playing of a master. And masters don't belong in the shadows. Friedrich walked away, leaving David and Isaac alone in the corridor. I can't do this, David whispered. You can, Isaac said. And you will. Not for the orchestra, not for the donors, but for yourself. David, you've been hiding for 18 years. Don't you think it's time to come home? David didn't answer. He just picked up his mop and continued cleaning, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the handle. That night, David sat in his tiny studio apartment, staring at his hands. They trembled constantly, a metronome of his brokenness. He thought about Elena, about the way she used to take his hands when they were young and tell him they were magic. He thought about Sophie, about the lullabies he'd played for her on his violin, about her tiny hands clapping in delight. He thought about the accident, about the screech of tires, about Elena's scream, about the sudden, awful silence that followed, about waking up in the hospital to learn that his entire world had ended in a single moment of random violence. The tremor in his hands grew worse. It always did when he remembered. But then he thought about the other night when he'd found that forgotten violin, about how, for 3 glorious minutes, his hands had been steady, about how the music had flowed through him like it used to, about how, for just a moment, he'd felt whole again. He looked at the clock. A.m. 7 hours until the audition. He should sleep. He should forget this insanity. He should accept that David Keller, the violinist, was dead, and David Keller, the janitor, was all that remained. But deep inside, in a place he'd thought had died with his family, something stirred. A tiny ember of the person he used to be. The person Elena had loved. The person Sophie had looked up to with adoring eyes. For you, David whispered to the empty apartment. I'll try. Just one more time. For you. He stood up and walked to his closet. In the back, hidden behind boxes of cleaning supplies and old clothes, was a case. He hadn't opened it in 18 years. His violin case. With trembling hands, he pulled it out and set it on his small table. The case was dusty, the leather cracked with age. He opened it slowly. Inside was a Stradivarius violin worth $1 million. A gift from his mentor Isaac on his 20th birthday. The Keller Strad, as it had become known in the classical music world. He'd forgotten how beautiful it was. David lifted the violin carefully. His hands shook so badly he almost dropped it. but he raised it to his shoulder, positioned his chin on the rest, and drew the bow across the strings. The sound that emerged was broken, shaky, awful. His trembling hands couldn't control the bow. The notes came out rough and uneven. He lowered the instrument, tears streaming down his face. "I can't," he said to the empty room. "I can't do it anymore." But then he heard Elena's voice in his memory. Not words, just her laugh. The way she used to laugh when he'd play badly on purpose to make her smile. The way she'd kiss his forehead and tell him to stop being dramatic and just play from the heart. David raised the violin again. This time, he closed his eyes. He didn't think about technique or performance or auditions. He thought about Elena, about Sophie, about the music they'd created together, not on instruments, but in life and love, in moments of perfect beauty. And slowly, miraculously, his hands stopped shaking. He began to play. A simple melody at first. A lullaby. Sophie's lullaby. The one he'd composed for her when she was born. The notes flowed clear and pure. His fingers moved with the muscle memory of 43 years of practice. The bow danced across the strings with perfect control. For 10 minutes, David played in his small apartment, playing for an audience of ghosts. And for 10 minutes, he was whole again. When he finished, his hands were steady. The tremor had vanished completely. "Okay," David said to the empty room, to Elena's memory, to Sophie's spirit. "Okay, I'll try. I'll go to the audition. I'll play. Not because I think I can succeed, but because you'd want me to try." He carefully placed the violin back in its case. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., he would walk onto that stage. He would face his fears. He would risk everything. And if he failed, well, he'd been failing for 18 years. One more failure wouldn't change anything. But if he succeeded, if he could play again, really play the way he used to, maybe, just maybe, he could find a reason to stop just surviving and start living again. David set his alarm for 7 a.m. and lay down on his bed. He didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion won, and he drifted off with the memory of music still singing in his hands. Tomorrow would change everything. He just didn't know it yet. At 8:45 a.m., David stood outside Benroya Hall, his violin case clutched in shaking hands. He'd thrown up twice that morning. His heart raced so fast he thought he might have a heart attack. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, go home, return to the safety of his mop and bucket. But he thought of Isaac, of the faith in his old mentor's eyes, and he thought of Elena, of how disappointed she'd be if he ran away now. He walked through the doors. The lobby was empty at this hour, silent except for the echo of his footsteps. David made his way to the main concert hall, his legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. When he pushed open the doors to the auditorium, he saw them waiting. Friedrich on the conductor's podium, Catherine in the first violin chair, Grace and several other orchestra members scattered throughout the seats. Jonathan stood near the back, arms crossed, and Isaac sat in the front row, his face lit with quiet pride. "Mr. Keller," Friedrich said, "you came. I confess, I had doubts." "So did I," David admitted, his voice barely audible. "Well then," Friedrich gestured to the stage, "let us see what you can do. We have a Guarneri violin for you to use. Unless you prefer your own instrument." David looked down at his case. "I have my own." He walked onto the stage, and the moment his foot touched the polished wood, memories crashed over him. Carnegie Hall, Berlin Philharmonic, Tokyo Opera House, stages all over the world where he'd triumphed. And now, 18 years later, he was back broken, trembling, terrified. He opened his case and lifted out the Stradivarius. Several orchestra members gasped. "Is that?" Catherine stood up, staring. "Is that a Strad?" "The Keller Strad," Isaac said quietly. "Dated 1703. One of only 500 Stradivarius violins still in existence." It was David's. "It's been silent for 18 years. David's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the bow. He took several deep breaths, trying to steady himself. "What will you play for us?" Friedrich asked. "The Paganini," David said. "Third movement. The passage that's been giving everyone trouble." "Just that passage?" Friedrich seemed surprised. "Not the full piece. If I can get through that passage without my hands betraying me," David said, "then we can talk about the full piece." But I need to know if I can still do this. If the music is still in me. Very well, Friedrich said. He looked at Catherine. Would you give him an A for tuning? Catherine raised her violin and played a clearer note. David tuned quickly, his fingers moving with automatic precision. Then he positioned the violin, closed his eyes, and for a moment, he simply stood there, breathing. The auditorium was silent, waiting. David raised the bow, and then he played. The first notes emerged tentative, uncertain. His hands shook slightly, but as he continued, something happened. The tremor faded. His fingers found their positions with mathematical precision. The bow moved across the strings with perfect pressure and speed, and then he reached the double-stop harmonics. What came out of that Stradivarius was nothing short of miraculous. David's left-hand fingers pressed the strings into places simultaneously, while his right-hand bow created the exact pressure needed to produce not just notes, but overtones, bell-like sounds that seemed to come from another dimension. His fingers moved so fast they blurred. The harmonics rang out clear and pure, creating a cascade of sound that was both technically perfect and emotionally devastating. He played the passage that had defeated 6 professional violinists, and he made it sound effortless. When he finished, silence filled the hall for 3 full seconds. Then Catherine started clapping, slowly at first, then faster. Grace joined in, then the other orchestra members. Even Jonathan, who'd been skeptical, was applauding. Friedrich stood frozen on his podium, his mouth slightly open. Mein Gott, he whispered. I have heard many great violinists in my life, but that was transcendent. David lowered the violin, his hands already beginning to shake again now that the music had stopped. That's all I can do, he said quietly. When I'm playing, the tremor stops. But the moment I stop, he held up his right hand, which was visibly trembling. This is my reality. But you can play, Isaac said from the front row, tears streaming down his face. David, you can still play. After all these years, all that suffering, the gift is still there. Who are you really? Catherine asked, walking closer to the stage. I mean, I heard what Professor Rosenberg said, but the Tchaikovsky competition, that was you? 18 years ago, David said. I was 28 years old. I thought I had my whole life ahead of me. I thought I'd play until I was 90, like Isaac Stern. I thought, his voice broke. I thought my wife and daughter would be there for every concert. I thought we'd grow old together. What happened to them? Grace asked gently, her earlier bitterness completely gone. David set down the violin carefully, as if it might shatter. Elena, my wife, was principal second violin with the New York Philharmonic. We met at Juilliard when we were 19. She was the most beautiful person I'd ever seen, and when she played, it was like listening to sunlight. We got married at 24. Sophie was born a year later. He sat down on the edge of the stage, lost in memory. Sophie loved music. At 3 years old, she couldn't carry a tune, but she'd clap along whenever we played. She said she wanted to play violin like Mommy and Daddy. We'd already bought her a tiny violin for her 4th birthday. The auditorium was silent except for David's voice. It was February 18, 2007. Late rehearsal at Avery Fisher Hall. Elena had brought Sophie to watch. On the way home, it was snowing. We were at a red light 3 blocks from our apartment. Sophie was asleep in her car seat. Elena was holding my hand. We were talking about summer plans. We wanted to take Sophie to Italy. His voice became hollow. The drunk driver ran the red light at 60 miles per hour. Witnesses said our car spun 3 times. I remember the impact. I remember Elena screaming. And then, nothing. I woke up 3 days later in the hospital. Broken ribs, punctured lung, fractured skull, but alive. Tears rolled down his face freely now. They were both gone. Elena died on impact. Sophie lived for 2 hours. I was unconscious. I never got to say goodbye. I never got to hold her one last time. I never got to tell her. He couldn't finish. Catherine had tears in her eyes. Grace was openly crying. Even Jonathan looked shaken. The tremor started 2 months after the accident. David continued. Essential tremor triggered by trauma, the doctors said. My hands shook constantly. I couldn't hold a violin. Couldn't play a note. My entire identity, everything I'd built my life around, was gone. Just like my family. I tried to keep going. I tried therapy, medication, everything. But I couldn't handle it. The guilt of surviving when they didn't. The fury at the drunk driver who got 8 years in prison, 8 years for 2 lives. The emptiness of a world without music, without Elena, without Sophie's laugh. He looked up at them. I tried to kill myself twice. Once with pills. Once by slitting my wrists. Both times, someone found me in time. They put me in a psychiatric hospital. I spent 3 years there, barely functional. When I got out, I couldn't go back to music. The pain was too much. So I became a janitor. I cleaned floors. I stayed invisible. It was safer that way. Until Tuesday night, Isaac said softly. Until Tuesday night, David agreed. I found that violin someone had left behind. And I don't know what possessed me, maybe it was the anniversary. February 18th was 2 weeks ago. 18 years. Maybe I needed to remember what it felt like to play. To be whole, even for just a moment. And Friedrich asked. And for 3 minutes, I wasn't broken, David said simply. For 3 minutes, I was me again. The tremor stopped. The pain faded. It was just me and the music and the memory of everyone I'd lost. It was the first time in 18 years I felt like I could breathe. Friedrich stepped down from the podium and approached David. Mr. Keller, David, I must apologize. When Isaac first suggested you, I laughed. I made assumptions. I saw a janitor, not a person, not an artist. I was wrong. You weren't wrong, David said. I am a janitor. That's what I've been for 3 years. No, Catherine said firmly, joining Friedrich. You're a violinist who's been cleaning floors. There's a difference. What you just played, that's not something you can fake. That's not something that goes away. That's who you are. I don't know if I can do a full performance, David admitted. Playing for 2 minutes in an empty auditorium is one thing. Playing a 20-minute concerto in front of thousands of people, with millions of dollars on the line, that's different. What if I freeze? What if the tremor comes back mid-performance? What if I fail? Then you fail, Isaac said, walking up to the stage. And the world keeps turning. But David, what if you succeed? What if you walk onto that stage and you play the way you just played? What if you show the world that trauma and loss and 18 years of silence can't kill true genius? I'm not a genius, David said. I'm just a man who lost everything. You're a man who lost everything and survived, Grace said, surprising everyone. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how strong you have to be? I've spent 40 years in this orchestra feeling sorry for myself because I never made concertmaster. But you lost your family, your career, your identity, and you're still here, still standing, still able to create beauty. That's not weakness. That's heroism. David looked at them, these people who'd been strangers an hour ago, who were now looking at him with respect and compassion. I need to think about this, David said. Can I have some time? You have until tomorrow morning, Jonathan said, speaking for the first time. The gala is in for days. If you agree to perform, we'll need to do a full rehearsal tomorrow afternoon, then a dress rehearsal the day after. It's an accelerated timeline, but if anyone can handle it, it's you. And if I say no, David asked, then we cancel the gala, Jonathan said simply. Because after hearing you play, I can't accept anyone else. It would be a lie. You're the real thing, David. The rest of us are just pretending. David packed up his violin carefully, his hands shaking again now that he wasn't playing. I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning. As he turned to leave, Catherine called out, David, thank you for being brave enough to try. I know that took more courage than I can imagine. David nodded and walked out of the auditorium, feeling like he was moving through a dream. Outside, in the February cold, he sat on a bench and stared at his violin case. Inside that case was the past, was the present, maybe even the future. His phone rang. He didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. David, it's Catherine Price. I got your number from Isaac. I hope that's okay. It's fine, David said, surprised. What can I do for you? I wanted to apologize, Catherine said, for how I treated you before I knew who you were, for the assumptions I made. That was wrong of me. You didn't know, David said. That's not an excuse, Catherine replied. I saw a janitor and dismissed you. I should have seen a person. I'm sorry. There was a pause. Then Catherine spoke again. "Can I tell you something? I became concertmaster 5 years ago. It's everything I worked for. But sometimes when I'm playing, I feel nothing. Just notes on a page. Technique without soul. But when you played today, I felt something I haven't felt in years. I remembered why I fell in love with music in the first place." "Thank you," David said, not sure what else to say. "Play at the gala," Catherine said. "Please, not for the orchestra, not for the donors, but for every musician who's forgotten why they started. Play and remind us." She hung up before David could respond. He sat there for another hour, watching people pass by, watching the city live its life, wondering if he had the courage to live his again. His phone rang again. Another unknown number. Single quotes, "Hello, Mr. Keller? This is Marcus Chen. I'm a music critic for the Seattle Times. I heard about your audition this morning. I'd love to do an interview with you about your comeback. I haven't agreed to perform yet," David said. "But you will," Marcus said confidently, "because you're David Keller, the man who made grown men weep with his interpretation of the Brahms Violin Concerto, the man who sold out Carnegie Hall 6 times in 1 year. You're a legend, sir, and legends don't stay hidden forever." "How did you get this number?" David asked. "I'm a journalist," Marcus said. "I have my sources. Will you agree to an interview?" "No," David said. "Not now. Maybe not ever." "Then can I at least write about today? About your audition?" "Please don't," David said. "If I decide to perform, I don't want it to be because of media pressure. I want it to be because it's the right choice for me." There was a pause. "I respect that," Marcus said. "But Murdoch Keller, the world deserves to hear you play again. We've been waiting 18 years. We can wait a little longer, but please, don't make us wait forever." David hung up and turned off his phone. He walked home through the cold streets, his violin case heavy in his trembling hands. When he reached his apartment, he set the case on the table and stared at it for a long time. Then he opened it and lifted out the Stradivarius. He didn't play. He just held it, feeling the weight of it, the history of it. This instrument had been played by masters for 300 years. It had survived wars and revolutions and centuries of change. And somehow, it had ended up in his hands. "What do I do?" David asked the violin, as if it could answer. "Elena, if you're listening, tell me what to do. Should I hide forever? Or should I risk everything one more time?" The apartment was silent, but then David heard it not with his ears, but with his heart. Elena's voice from memory. "Life is risk, David. Love is risk. Music is risk. And you've never been afraid of risk. Don't start now." He raised the violin to his shoulder and began to play. Not the Paganini, not a concerto, just a simple melody. Sophie's Lullaby. The notes floated through his small apartment, carrying with them all the love and loss and hope of 18 years. His hands were steady. His bow moved with perfect control. And for those few minutes, David wasn't broken. He was home. When he finished, he carefully put away the violin and picked up his phone. He turned it back on and called Isaac. "Professor," David said when Isaac answered. "I'll do it. I'll play at the gala." "David," Isaac's voice was thick with emotion. "You won't regret this." "I might," David said honestly. "I'm terrified. My hands are shaking just thinking about it. But I need to try. For Elena, for Sophie, for myself." "Then we rehearse tomorrow," Isaac said. "And David, I've waited 18 years to hear you play again. Thank you for coming back to us." After hanging up, David stood at his window, looking out at Seattle's skyline. Somewhere out there were thousands of people who would attend the gala. Somewhere out there was his future, whatever that might be. He thought about Elena, about the way she used to kiss his hands and tell him they were magic. He thought about Sophie, about her tiny applause and her bright laughter. "I'm going to play for you," David whispered to the night. "I'm going to step onto that stage and I'm going to play like I did before the world ended. And maybe, just maybe, I'll find a reason to keep living instead of just surviving." His hands trembled as he stood there, but in his heart, something had changed. The ember that had been dying for 18 years had caught flame. David Keller was coming back, and the world was about to remember why he'd been called the greatest violinist of his generation. That night, David dreamed of Elena for the first time in years. In the dream, they were at Juilliard again, young and full of hope. She was playing the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto in the practice room, and he sat watching her, mesmerized by the way she moved, the way the music seemed to flow from her like breathing. "You're staring," Elena said in the dream, pausing mid-phrase. "I can't help it," David replied. "You're extraordinary." "We both are," Elena corrected, setting down her violin and walking to him. "Together, we're going to change the world, David. We're going to show people what music can be, what love can be." "I miss you," David said, though in the dream he didn't yet know he'd lose her. "I miss you so much." Elena smiled and placed her hand over his heart. "I'm always here, in every note you play, in every breath you take. Don't hide from the music, David. It's who you are. It's who we were together." He woke with tears on his face and Elena's name on his lips. The first full rehearsal was scheduled for 9 a.m. the next morning. David arrived early, his Stradivarius case clutched in trembling hands. The orchestra members were already warming up when he entered, scales and arpeggios filling the air in a discordant symphony of preparation. Catherine saw him first. "David, good morning. How are you feeling?" "Terrified," David admitted. "I didn't sleep much." "That makes two of us," Catherine said with a small smile. "I kept thinking about what you said yesterday, about hearing Elena in the melody. I've never thought about music that way before, as a connection to people we've lost. It's the only connection I have left," David said quietly. Friedrich arrived and clapped his hands for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, let us begin. David, please take your position. We will start with the orchestral exposition. Then you join at measure 37. David stood at the soloist's position, his violin ready. The orchestra began the opening tutti, the dramatic, sweeping introduction that set the stage for the soloist's entrance. David closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, remembering the first time he'd played this piece with Elena in the audience, remembering her proud smile from the front row. Then came his entrance. He raised his bow and played. The first notes emerged clean and pure, his hands steady despite his racing heart. The orchestra supported him, Friedrich's conducting precise and encouraging. And for the next 40 minutes, they worked through the first movement, stopping occasionally for technical adjustments, but mostly playing through. When they finished, the orchestra members burst into spontaneous applause. "Incredible," Friedrich said, his eyes shining. "David, that was. I have no words." The phrasing in measures 63 through 71 was perfection. The way you shaped that melodic line, the dynamics, the expression, it was exactly right. "Thank you," David said, his hands already beginning to shake now that he'd stopped playing. "But I'm worried about the cadenza, the speed in the final runs. My fingers feel slower than they used to." "You're 51 years old," Isaac said from where he sat observing. "You're not supposed to have the speed of a 28-year-old. But David, you have something now that you didn't have then. Depth, maturity, wisdom born from suffering. The technical brilliance is still there, but now it serves a deeper purpose." Grace approached the stage during the break. "Mr. Keller, David, I owe you an apology. A real one. Yesterday I said some kind words, but I want you to know I meant them. I've spent 40 years being bitter about my career, about never achieving what I thought I deserved. But watching you play, seeing what you've overcome, I realize how petty my complaints are. You lost everything and still found a way back. I just lost my ego." "Your feelings are valid," David said gently. "Pain isn't a competition. Your disappointment matters, even if it's different from mine." "You're kind," Grace said. "Kinder than I deserve. Would you be willing to have coffee with me sometime? I'd like to hear your story. Really hear it. Not just the dramatic parts, but the everyday parts. How you survived, how you kept going. I'd like that," David said, surprised by how much he meant it. The afternoon rehearsal focused on the second and third movements. The third movement was the most technically demanding, full of rapid-fire passages, double stops, and the infamous harmonics that had defeated so many violinists. David worked through it methodically, his muscle memory gradually awakening after 18 years of sleep. But there was one passage that gave him trouble, a series of ascending runs in the highest register, requiring perfect intonation and lightning-fast finger work. He tried it 5 times, and each time, he stumbled slightly on the transition between positions. Again, Friedrich said patiently, "David, you're rushing. Let the tempo breathe. Trust your fingers. They know what to do." David tried again. Still not quite right. "Take a break," Isaac suggested. "Come sit with me." David set down his violin and joined Isaac in the front row. His hands were shaking badly now, frustrated by the imperfection. "I can't get it right," David said. "That passage used to be easy for me. I could play it in my sleep. Now I can barely make it through without mistakes." "Because you're thinking about it," Isaac said. "You're trying to force it instead of letting it flow." "David, do you remember what I used to tell you when you were learning difficult passages?" "Sing it first," David said, remembering. "If you can sing it, you can play it." "Exactly," Isaac said. "So sing it for me, right now." David felt foolish, but he sang the passage not with words, just with vocalization. His voice followed the melodic line, the rises and falls, the rhythmic patterns. And as he sang, he felt the passage in his body, understood its shape and flow in a way that went beyond mechanical finger movements. "Now play it," Isaac said. David returned to the stage, raised his violin, and played the passage. This time, his fingers flowed naturally through the position changes, guided by the internalized understanding of the melody rather than conscious technical thought. It was perfect. The orchestra erupted in applause. "That's it," Friedrich shouted. "That's exactly it. David, when you stopped thinking and started feeling, the passage became alive. Remember that for the performance. Don't think, feel." That evening, after everyone else had left, David remained on stage. He sat in the empty auditorium, his violin on his lap, looking out at the rows of seats that would soon be filled with people expecting greatness. "Elena," he said to the silence, "I'm scared. What if I fail? What if I get out there and my hands betray me? What if I prove that the old David Keller is really gone?" The auditorium offered no answer, but David felt a presence not supernatural, just the memory of Elena, so strong it felt real. "You used to tell me that the audience doesn't hear our mistakes," David continued, speaking to the memory. "They hear our intention, our emotion, our truth. You said that technical perfection without soul is just noise, but soul without perfect technique is transcendent. I never really understood that until now." He raised his violin and began to play, not the Paganini, but a piece Elena had loved, Massenet's Meditation from. Ties. It was slow, lyrical, achingly beautiful. As he played, David poured into it all the love he'd never stopped feeling, all the grief he'd carried for 18 years, all the hope that was slowly rebuilding in his heart. When he finished, he heard clapping from the back of the auditorium. Friedrich emerged from the shadows. "I came back to retrieve my score. I didn't mean to intrude." "It's okay," David said, wiping his eyes. "I was just talking to my wife. She would be proud," Friedrich said, walking down the aisle. "David, I must tell you something. I have conducted orchestras for 35 years. I have worked with the greatest soloists in the world, but I have never witnessed playing like yours. The way you inhabit the music, the way you transform it into something beyond notes and rhythms. It's a gift that comes once in a generation. It's all I have left of them," David said. "When I play, I'm not alone anymore. They're there with me, in the sound, in the silence between the notes, in the resonance that lingers after the last chord. Then play for them on Saturday," Friedrich said. "Play for Elena and Sophie. The rest of us will just be privileged to witness it." The next day brought unexpected challenges. David woke with his hands shaking more violently than usual. The stress and lack of sleep were taking their toll. When he tried to practice in his apartment that morning, he could barely hold the bow steady. Panic set in. What if this happened during the performance? What if the tremor didn't stop when he started playing? What if he'd fooled himself into thinking he was healed? He called Isaac, his voice shaking as badly as his hands. "Professor, I can't do this. My hands won't stop shaking. It's worse than ever." "Come to the hall," Isaac said calmly. "Right now. Don't bring your violin. Just come." When David arrived, Isaac led him to a small practice room. "Sit," Isaac said, pointing to a chair. David sat, his hands trembling in his lap. "Now close your eyes," Isaac instructed. "And breathe. Just breathe." "That's not going to fix this," David said. No, it's not, Isaac agreed. But it will calm you enough to remember something important. David, the tremor is part of you. It's not your enemy. It's not something to fight. It's just your nervous system responding to stress and trauma. The more you fight it, the worse it gets. But I can't play like this, David said, opening his eyes to show Isaac his violently shaking hands. You're not playing right now, Isaac pointed out. Right now, you're in crisis mode. Your body is protecting you from perceived danger by making it impossible to do the thing that scares you. It's not logical, but it's how trauma works. So what do I do? David asked desperately. You accept it, Isaac said. You stop fighting. You acknowledge that yes, your hands shake. Yes, you have a neurological condition. Yes, you've been through unimaginable trauma. And then you remember that when you play, when you truly connect to the music, none of that matters. The tremor stops not because you force it to, but because you're finally doing what you were meant to do. David sat in silence for a long moment, watching his hands shake. Then, slowly, he began to speak. When Sophie was born, Elena and I brought her home from the hospital, and I was terrified. Terrified I'd drop her, hurt her, fail her somehow. My hands were shaking then too, not from tremor, just from fear. And Elena said, David, your hands held a $4 million violin before you could legally drink. They've played for presidents and queens. They know what to do. Trust them. Wise woman, Isaac said. She was right, David continued. The moment I held Sophie, really held her, my hands steadied. Because love is stronger than fear. Music is the same way. When I love the music more than I fear the failure, my body remembers what to do. Exactly, Isaac said. So stop fearing the tremor. Stop fearing the performance. Just love the music. Love the memory of your family. Love the gift you've been given. Everything else will follow. David took a deep breath and stood up. Can I use this practice room for an hour? It's yours, Isaac said. David called the hall administrator and had his Stradivarius brought to him. When he was alone in the practice room, he opened the case and looked at the instrument for a long moment. Okay, he said to the violin. No more fear. No more fighting. Just music. He raised the instrument to his shoulder, and despite his wildly shaking hands, he began to play. The first notes were rough, unsteady, but he kept playing, not fighting the tremor, just playing through it. Gradually, slowly, his hands began to steady. The music became clearer, and after 10 minutes of pure determination and trust, the tremor vanished completely. David played for an hour straight, working through the Paganini, building his confidence back up. When he finally stopped, he felt centered again, calm. Ready. The dress rehearsal was that evening. As David prepared backstage, he received an unexpected visitor. Mr. Keller? David turned to see a man in his 30s, dressed in an expensive suit, holding a violin case. I'm James Morrison, the man said. My father was Lawrence Morrison, the zoo owner. David felt his blood run cold. Lawrence Morrison, the man whose cruelty to animals had indirectly led to David's breakdown years ago, though David had never been directly involved. But the name still triggered painful associations with that dark period of his life. What do you want? I'm a violinist too, James said. And I wanted to tell you that what you're doing coming back after everything, it's inspiring. My father and I were never close. He was difficult, but I learned violin despite him, not because of him. And hearing your story about losing everything and finding your way back through music, it reminded me why I play. David stared at this man, trying to process this unexpected encounter. I just wanted to say thank you, James continued, for showing people like me that it's never too late. That tragedy doesn't have to be the end of the story. I'll be at the gala tomorrow, and I know you're going to be extraordinary. After James left, David sat in his dressing room, overwhelmed. Here was a stranger, offering encouragement, seeing hope in David's brokenness. It was almost too much to process. The dress rehearsal itself went smoothly. David played with growing confidence, his technique solid, his interpretation deepening with each run-through. The preview audience, about 200 donors who'd paid extra to attend, gave him a standing ovation. That lasted 5 full minutes. Afterward, more people approached him with their stories. A woman whose husband had PTSD and found healing in music. A man whose son had autism and played piano beautifully despite being nonverbal. A teenager with severe anxiety who said watching David play gave her hope, that her shaking hands wouldn't stop her from pursuing her dreams. Her name was Emma Rodriguez. She was 23, a student at the Seattle Conservatory, and she carried a violin case. Keller? Emma approached him nervously. I have essential tremor too. I was diagnosed 2 years ago. My teachers told me to give up on performance. But watching you tonight, you gave me hope. David looked at her shaking hands and saw himself. How bad is yours? Bad enough that I can barely practice anymore, Emma said, tears forming. I love music more than anything, but my body won't cooperate. Can I see you play? David asked. Emma looked surprised but nodded. She opened her case and pulled out a student violin. She raised it to her shoulder, and David watched as her hands trembled badly, making the bow jump across the strings. The sound that came out was rough, unsteady. Close your eyes, David said gently. Don't think about your hands. Think about why you love music. What does it mean to you? Emma closed her eyes and took a breath. My grandmother had Alzheimer's. The last year of her life, she didn't recognize anyone, except when I played violin. Then, for just a few minutes, she'd smile. She'd remember. Music was the only thing that brought her back. Then play for her, David said. Right now. Play something you played for your grandmother. Emma raised the violin again and began to play a simple Bach minuet. And as she focused on the memory, on the love, on the meaning behind the music, her hands steadied. Not perfectly, the tremor was still there, faint but present. But the music became clearer, more controlled, more beautiful. When she finished, Emma opened her eyes in wonder. I've never been able to play that smoothly. The tremor doesn't control you, David said. It's just something your body does. But when you connect to why you play, when you connect to the emotion, the purpose, the love, your body remembers what it's supposed to do. It's not about perfect technique. It's about perfect intention. Emma stared at him. Will you teach me? After the gala? I know you're not taking students, but I'm not a teacher, David said. I'm just someone who's learned to live with this condition. But Emma, after tomorrow, come find me. We'll figure something out together. Maybe we can help each other. Emma hugged him impulsively. Thank you. Thank you so much. As she walked away, Isaac appeared at David's side. You just changed that girl's life. I just offered to talk to her, David said. No, Isaac corrected. You gave her hope. And sometimes, hope is everything. The night before the gala, David couldn't sleep. He lay in his apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 18 years of loss, 18 years of hiding, and now, one performance that could change everything. At 3 a.m., he gave up trying to sleep and picked up his violin. He played softly, not wanting to disturb his neighbors, running through passages from the Paganini, making sure his muscle memory was solid. And as he played, he whispered to the darkness, Elena, Sophie, if you're listening, tomorrow I play for you. I play for every moment we had together. I play for the future we never got to share. I play because you taught me that music isn't about perfection. It's about love. And I've never stopped loving you. The day of the gala arrived cold and clear. David woke early, showered, and put on his tuxedo, the one Jonathan had arranged for him. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. But there was something different in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there for 18 years. Hope. At 6 p.m., he arrived at Benaroya Hall. The venue was already filling with elegantly dressed donors, music lovers, and critics. David slipped in through the stage door, avoiding the crowds, making his way to his dressing room. Friedrich found him there an hour before the performance. How are you feeling? Terrified, David admitted. His hands were shaking badly, and he had to fight to keep from throwing up. What if I can't do this? Then we'll stop, Friedrich said simply. David, there's no shame in trying and failing. The shame is in never trying at all. But I don't think you'll fail. I think you're going to walk onto that stage and you're going to remind the world what true artistry sounds like. Catherine knocked and entered. David, I wanted to give you something. She held out a small photograph. This is my daughter. She's 7. She started violin lessons last year because she saw me play. Last night, I told her about you. about your story. And she said, "Mommy, I want to play like the man who never gave up. So I wanted you to know you're already changing lives, even before you play a single note tonight." David looked at the photograph of a little girl with a violin, and his eyes filled with tears. She was about the age Sophie would have been when she started lessons. "Tell her thank you," David said, "and tell her that every time she plays, she's creating something beautiful, something that can never be taken away." At 7:30 p.m., the house lights dimmed. The audience settled into their seats, nearly 3,000 people. Friedrich walked onto the stage to thunderous applause and turned to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our annual charity gala. Tonight, you will witness something extraordinary. Our soloist for Paganini's Third Violin Concerto is a man who needs no introduction to those who knew him 18 years ago. To those who don't, let me simply say this. You are about to hear one of the greatest violinists who has ever lived. Please welcome David Keller." David walked onto the stage, his violin in hand, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. The applause was deafening. He looked out at the sea of faces and felt panic rising. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. Then he saw Isaac in the front row, tears already streaming down his face, mouthing the words, "You've got this." He saw Catherine in her chair, giving him an encouraging nod. He saw Emma Rodriguez in the audience, her hands clasped together in hope. David closed his eyes and thought of Elena, of Sophie, of the lullabies he'd played for his daughter, of the duets he'd performed with his wife. He raised the Stradivarius to his shoulder. His hands stopped shaking. Friedrich raised his baton, and David began to play. What happened over the next 25 minutes would be talked about for years. David didn't just perform the Paganini, he inhabited it, transformed it, made it his own. The impossible passages became vehicles for expressing every emotion he'd held inside for 18 years. The grief, the loss, the hope, the redemption, all of it poured through his fingers and into that 300-year-old instrument. When he reached the cadence of the section, where the orchestra stops and the soloist plays alone, David closed his eyes and let the music speak. He thought of Sophie's laugh, of Elena's smile, of the life they'd built together and the future they'd been denied. And he played it all, the joy and the sorrow, the love and the loss, the darkness and the light. Tears streamed down his face as he played, but his hands remained steady. His bow flew across the strings, creating sounds that seemed impossible, multiple voices singing simultaneously, harmonics that rang like distant bells, runs so fast they blurred into pure emotion. The audience sat transfixed. Many were crying openly. Musicians in the orchestra, hardened professionals who'd heard everything, stared in awe. When David played the final note, there was a moment of complete silence. The note hung in the air, fading slowly, reluctantly, like it didn't want to end. Then the auditorium exploded. The audience rose as one, applauding, shouting, crying. The ovation lasted 15 minutes. David stood on the stage, overwhelmed, his violin hanging loosely in his shaking hands now that the music was over. Friedrich embraced him. Catherine was crying in her chair. Isaac stood in the front row, applauding with tears streaming down his face. Emma Rodriguez was on her feet, cheering. David bowed again and again, not knowing what else to do. This was beyond anything he'd experienced before. This was more than appreciation for technical skill. This was recognition of something deeper, a soul that had been shattered and somehow pieced itself back together through sheer force of love. When the applause finally died down enough for people to hear, Friedrich addressed the audience again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have raised tonight over $15 million for youth music programs. But more importantly, we have been reminded why music matters, why art matters, why we must never give up, no matter how dark things seem. Thank you, David, for coming back to us." Backstage, David was immediately surrounded by well-wishers, donors wanting to shake his hand, critics wanting quotes, musicians wanting to thank him. But David saw Emma Rodriguez standing in the corner, her violin case in hand, tears streaming down her face. He made his way through the crowd to her. "Did you see?" Emma asked. "Did you see what you did? You didn't just play. You showed us that it's possible, that we can be broken and still create beauty. Will you come work with me?" David asked. not as my student, as my partner. I want to start a music therapy program for people with neurological conditions, with PTSD, with depression. I want to show them what you and I have learned, that music can heal, that our disabilities don't define us. Yes, Emma said immediately. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Over the next several months, David's life transformed in ways he never imagined. He was offered positions at major orchestras around the world, but he turned them all down. Instead, he used the money from the gala and from donations that poured in afterward to establish the Elena and Sophie Keller Music Therapy Center. The center offered free music lessons and therapy to anyone dealing with trauma, disability, or mental health challenges. Emma became his assistant director. They recruited teachers from around the country, all of them people who'd overcome their own challenges to find healing in music. David also formed a community orchestra that included musicians with disabilities of all kinds, blind violinists, deaf percussionists who felt vibrations, pianists with cerebral palsy, cellists with essential tremor. They called themselves the Phoenix Orchestra, and their first concert sold out in minutes. Catherine left the Seattle Symphony to join David's project, saying she'd finally found music that mattered. Grace retired and volunteered as a mentor, working with older adults who'd always dreamed of learning an instrument. Even Friedrich occasionally conducted for them, admitting that this ragtag group of broken musicians played with more heart than most professional orchestras. But David never stopped being a janitor. 3 mornings a week, he arrived at Benaroya Hall at 6 a.m. and cleaned, just as he had for 3 years. When asked why, he said, "Because I need to remember where I came from. I need to remember that my worth isn't in applause or fame. It's in showing up, doing the work, and finding meaning in the ordinary." Jonathan, who'd initially worried about image and reputation, became one of David's biggest supporters. He helped secure grants and funding for the therapy center, saying, "David taught me that greatness isn't about perfection. It's about courage. And he's the bravest person I've ever met." 1 year after the gala, on the anniversary of the accident, David stood at Elena and Sophie's graves with his violin. He played Sophie's lullaby, letting the music carry his love across whatever divide separated the living from the dead. "I did it," David whispered when he finished. "I came back, not to prove anything to anyone else, but to prove to myself that your deaths weren't the end of my story, that I could survive losing you and still find a reason to live." The wind rustled through the trees, and David could have sworn he heard Elena's laugh, Sophie's giggle. "I'll keep playing," David promised. "For you, for me, for everyone who's lost everything and doesn't know how to find their way back. I'll keep showing them that the music never really stops. It just waits for us to be brave enough to play again." He packed up his violin and walked back to his car. His hands shook as he drove, but he didn't mind anymore. The tremor was just part of him now. Not a curse, not a disability, just a reminder that he was alive, that he'd survived, that he'd found a way forward. That evening, David taught a class at the therapy center. 20 students with various challenges: tremors, anxiety disorders, depression, PTSD. He stood before them with his shaking hands visible and said, "Music won't cure you. It won't take away your pain or fix your disabilities, but it will give you a voice when words fail. It will give you community when you feel alone, and it will remind you that broken things can still create beauty." He raised his violin and played. His hands trembled, but the moment the bow touched the strings, they steadied. And as his students watched, they saw living proof that the human spirit could survive anything, could overcome anything, could transform anything, even tragedy, into art. Emma stood beside him, her own violin ready. Her hands shook too, but when she began to play alongside David, they steadied. Together, teacher and student, survivor and survivor, they created something beautiful. The music filled the room, pure and clear and perfect. And in that moment, 20 broken people felt whole. Because David Keller had learned what Elena had tried to teach him all those years ago, that life is risk, love is risk, music is risk, and that the bravest thing any of us can do is keep playing, even when our hands shake, even when our hearts break, even when the world says it's impossible. The music never really stops. It just waits for us to be brave enough to begin again. 5 years later, David stood on the stage at Carnegie Hall once more. But this time, he wasn't alone. The Phoenix Orchestra surrounded him, 50 musicians with disabilities, each one a testament to the power of perseverance and community. The concert was sold out. Critics from around the world had come to witness what many were calling a revolution in classical music, proof that art belonged to everyone, not just the able-bodied elite. Before they began, David addressed the audience. 18 years ago, I stood on this stage as a man who thought he had everything. Tonight, I stand here as a man who lost everything and discovered that was exactly what I needed to find what truly matters. These musicians beside me, they're not here despite their disabilities. They're here because their disabilities taught them something able-bodied musicians often forget, that music isn't about perfection. It's about truth, and the truest music comes from hearts that have been broken and put back together. He raised his violin, hands still trembling, until the bow touched the strings and began to play. The Phoenix Orchestra joined him, creating a sound that was imperfect and glorious, human and transcendent, broken and whole all at once. And somewhere, David knew Elena and Sophie were listening, and they were proud.